Hi, my name is Maggie Shaw, and today I'll be presenting on my research paper, Working Women and Suffragists in 20th Century New York, a social movement synthesis exhibited in 1911. So first of all, as America entered the 20th century, the country became immersed in the prominent display of social reform and political activism commonly known as the Progressive Era. Progressive Era reformers pushed for a plethora of disparate causes in areas of everyday life, recreational activities, and governance. As a wide array of groups pushed for change simultaneously, some movements recognized the benefit of combining forces with others. From 1911 to 1915, New York witnessed a particularly prominent display of social movement synthesis between working women and suffragists. Following the tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, a meeting was held at Cooper Union where the suffragist Anna Howard Shaw and working women of New York came together for social change, labor reform, and female enfranchisement. Anna Howard Shaw's ideology, the suffrage tactics in New York City, and the social movement synthesis at the 1911 Cooper Union meeting all exhibit the larger patterns of cooperation in the early 20th century as women crossed boundaries of class and geography to unite for social change and the vote for women. The environment of rapid social change in America during the Progressive Era has been thoroughly studied by historians and political scientists alike. However, modern scholarship on the Progressive Era retains a separate sphere's flavor, where women are concerned with social and moral issues, but they're left out of the politics. Politics remain male. In fact, modern scholarship on the Progressive Era tends to minimize or even omit women's suffrage as a part of the Progressive Era. Once, however, you view the American women's suffrage movement within the context of the Progressive Era itself, the complex nature and interconnectedness of women's suffrage with other social and political reform movements of the time is revealed. The suffrage movement, like others of this era, becomes interwoven in the tapestry of American cultural change and becomes a reflection of the struggles, wants, and new understandings of a diverse group of American men and women. For my literature, for my research paper, I largely focused on, I organized my secondary sources into these four sections. The four sections of my paper focus on Anna Howard Shaw and suffragists, working women of New York, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and the Cooper Union social movement synthesis. As you can see here, I had quite a few secondary sources. However, the ones highlighted in orange are what we'll be going over here quickly. First is Glenn Kugel's dissertation titled The Speeches of Anna Howard Shaw. He was a student who created a dissertation to get his doctorate on Anna Howard Shaw and collected all of her speeches that he could find, at least the transcripts of, and built up other ones from notations within her diaries. She spoke over 10,000 times in her lifetime. However, she did repeat speeches many times. So the whole composite of the transcripts that Glenn Kugel created is about 500 pages. To say that this is very helpful would be an understatement. I was able to really hear the words that she was saying as she said them and build up her ideology as it was created over many years. Second is Susan Goodyear's book, Women Will Vote, Winning Suffrage in New York. In her book here, it's a monograph on New York suffrage. It really focuses on labor history and suffrage history, and is the only book I could find that really compares the two of them, and that was extremely helpful as I began to build my argument for this social movement synthesis. Additionally, I have Annalise Orlick's book, Common Sense and a Little Fire. This focuses on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and its effect on working women. While it focuses much more on labor history, it did offer a very powerful foundation for building up why working women were susceptible to the suffrage argument at the time. Arthur McEvoy also wrote a very helpful article called The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire of 1911. In this article, he goes over the very detailed specifics of what happened during the fire and after the fire, and this is, again, very helpful in building up that foundation to discuss from. Ellen Du Bois wrote a article focusing on working women, class relations, and suffrage militants. This is, again, a very helpful article speaking about the combination of working women and suffragists. However, it does focus more on the more militant groups of the time. That being said, it was very helpful in understanding the issues of class tension between working women and suffragists and why that was a barrier that they had to overcome. Additionally, I used a plethora of primary sources. I especially focused on New York Times articles, which we thankfully had in the Sanford archives, as well as primary sources based off of Anna Howard Shaw's speeches, suffrage events, and this autobiography that Anna Howard Shaw wrote. So first up, Helen Bennett. She wrote The American Women in Civic Work. This is a very narrative style bibliography written just 4 years after the Triangle Fire on Anna Howard Shaw, so while she was still alive. It is more of a fan book about Anna Howard Shaw, and so to say that it's completely factual would probably not be entirely true. However, it is very helpful in establishing what the public thought of Anna Howard Shaw as an individual. Additionally, Mills Harriet, this was her New York suffrage newsletter copy. These were newsletters that were passed around the nation during the time of suffrage fighting. The newsletters were meant to keep the suffragists informed, funded, and in sync. This particular newsletter was sent to New York a few years before the fire occurred. And in this newsletter, it really establishes the importance of young women to the organization, as well as a factual basis for stating that Anna Howard Shaw was the president and in New York at the time of the fire. Additionally, I have the story of a pioneer, which is Anna Howard Shaw's autobiography. This is really a narrative account of her family history and personal experiences. It's very valuable in understanding her development of her ideology and her really, perspective as a human as she went through life. I also relied heavily, as I stated before, on the New York Times articles. This here might be difficult to see, is an example of the kind of articles I was working with. But after reading through 3 months of them, I eventually found 4 specific days that were very helpful as far as building up either information about the fire itself or the Cooper's Union meeting and establishing that it happened and who was there, in addition to public outrage following the fire. Finally, I really focused on Anna Howard Shaw's speeches. Again, she spoke 10,000 times in her lifetime, and to use all of that would be almost silly. However, I found 4 speeches that she gave in New York around the time of my time period of interest that spoke to her ideology, as well as kind of that arc of ideology from beginning to end of 1911 to 1915 and how that shift occurred. Now we'll move on into the body of my paper. My thesis for my paper is here on the screen, but I'll read it to you as well. Anna Howard Shaw's ideology, the suffragist tactics in New York City, and the social movement synthesis at the 1911 Cooper Union meeting all exhibit the larger patterns of cooperation in the early 20th century as women crossed boundaries of class and geography to unite for social change and the vote for women in America. Now, as we discussed before, the progressive era has been covered by historians. The environment of rapid social change that was created has been fully studied. However, once American women's suffrage movement is viewed within the context of the progressive era, you really can start to see the complex nature and interconnectedness of women's suffrage with other social and political reform movements of the time. The suffrage movement, like the others of the era, became interwoven within the tapestry of American cultural change, and it's important to really view that and understand what that means. American women's suffrage. The history of women's suffrage in America is hardly that of a fully cohesive movement with a simple trajectory toward the vote. In fact, the suffrage movement, especially at this time and moving into the 20th century, was marked by disagreement, complications, and internal controversy. In fact, the disagreements came to such a height that in 1890, before 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association and American Women's Suffrage Association split to create 2 distinct movements. It was not until 1890 that those 2 organizations again merged under the name or title National American Women's Suffrage Association, and this was under the guidance of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. One of the big questions for the suffragists at the time was whether they should focus nationally or in a state-by-state basis, and most of them entered the 20th century agreeing on a dual front, but that they would focus on individual states. In the state-by-state campaign, New York particularly represented an important state that had not accepted female enfranchisement in 1900. As suffragists began to rethink how they would go about their New York campaign, they also began to reevaluate their ideology regarding the labor reform movement and working women. Under the guidance of Susan B. Anthony, the New York women's suffrage campaign began to recognize a great opportunity in a new persuasive campaign regarding the labor and political issues of New York. The suffragists hoped that by expanding their rhetoric and personalizing their ideology to New York's labor and political issues, they would be able to gain additional suffragist allies. The suffragist shift toward understanding the potential value of other progressive era reformers laid the groundwork for emerging social movement synthesis in New York in the 20th century. Susan B. Anthony, as we stated before, was the flagship president of NASA as they entered the 20th century. However, she knew that she was getting older and that her health was beginning to fail. Anthony recognized the importance of establishing strong female leadership for the suffrage campaign and that the American suffragists really needed an individual to rally behind. That being said, she carefully cultivated two successors for this purpose, Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw. For the purposes of my study, it's best to focus on Anna Howard Shaw because she was the president of the organization during the fire of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and she had a very unique ability to bring a diverse group of people for suffrage. She was a complex individual who was uniquely situated to serve as a unifying force. She was born into a poor family who actually started in England and then moved over to America. Her father was a dreamer and an idealist and largely forgot regularly about his family's welfare and put them into an impoverished state regularly in her childhood. Seeing this and seeing her mother struggle, especially when they were in a frontier farm where her father left the family to survive on their own in an empty log cabin in totally untamed forest, she decided that education was going to be her way out. So she dedicated her time as a child to enrolling herself into the local high school and then saving up money slowly through the years until she could put herself through college to become a minister. She became a female minister, and after much struggle, she pushed herself into a minister position at a church. However, that being said, throughout her career educationally and as a minister, she faced many barriers just because she was a woman. With these struggles, she decided to go back to college and got her degree as a doctor and became the first female in America to hold doctoral, as in doctor and minister degrees at the same time. Additionally, though, even as a medical missionary, she still struggled with issues as being a woman in the workforce. She ended up in the Boston slums as a medical missionary, where she cared for sick prostitutes and impoverished women. She, at the time, continued being influenced throughout her life by female role models. One important female role model that we'll get to soon would be Susan B. Anthony, who she met soon after her time in the Boston slums. There, she was persuaded slowly but surely to become a full-time suffragist. She developed a unique suffrage vision because she had such a unique life. She really felt the pain that married women and women without a voice felt because she had seen how her mother had suffered at the hands of her father with no rights and no economic rights to help herself. She also really felt the pain of working women because not only has she experienced severe poverty in her childhood, she also had personal experience of how difficult it was to be a woman in the workplace. Additionally, she had felt the pain of lower class women by ministering to them in the Boston slums and elsewhere as a doctor and as a minister. So while she was in Boston, she realized that she had been, quote, treating the symptoms of societal disease rather than destroying the root cause. From this, she decided that change simply wasn't going to happen until women had political power, and the only way to get political power in a democracy was through the power of the vote. She had experienced both upper class and lower class life, and she entered into a suffrage movement that was really struggling with those class barriers. Because of that, she was a unique bridge for those women because she could speak to both of them as someone who had experienced their way of life. In fact, under her leadership, NASA grew from a membership of about 13,000 in 1893 to over 2 million in 1917. Under Sean Anthony's leadership, NASA began to shift to a new core ideology regarding working women and women of lower class. In the past, NASA had largely been working for working class women. The elite women of the suffrage cause had been advocating for suffrage in the name of all women, and yet had not included all women in their own organization. Under Shaw and Anthony's leadership, suffragists began to shift towards a new outlook whereby suffragists would not merely uplift working women, but would rather empower them and work with them to help themselves. Shaw brought women of all walks of life together under the singular belief that it is the right of a human being to have a voice in the government under which he or she lives. She and other suffrage reformers reasoned that once women won political rights, their economic rights, including fair wages, shorter working hours, and safer conditions would follow. The suffragists grew to highlight the issue of an America where women had no voice in the government yet were expected to obey its laws and pay the taxes to support it. Additionally, that being said, anyway, while suffragists were pushing to help working women were not waiting around for suffragists to save them. Working women were joining together in large numbers and pushing for pushing their grievances into the public eye. However, despite these large numbers and their strong industrial presence, working women had few rights. They were largely temporary workers who remained in the workforce from 4 to 6 years between graduation of school and marriage. Because of this, they largely saw themselves as transient. They saw themselves as daughters and sisters and future wives rather as workers in their own right, just as the world viewed them. This proved to be a major stumbling block for union organizations. However, that being said, working women spent years under bad working conditions, low pay, and suffering the additional burden of sexual harassment. Working women began to recognize that they had to join together if they wished for any concrete change. This developed later into the New York chapter of the Women's Trade Union League. The New York chapter of the WTUL was formed in 1905 and was a feminist labor organization that stressed that women should learn to be active, forceful unionists, and both in their workplace and their organizations. This came to a height November 23, 1909, after an inflammatory speech by a young woman named Clara Limelick. Following Limelick's speech, 20,000 to 40,000 young shirtwaist makers went on a strike for better wages and conditions. However, the strike was dubbed by the press very negatively. The working women were vilified in the newspapers, and while they went out striking, their positions were quickly given away and they lost their jobs to other women taking their place. Change simply was not coming quickly enough. This all culminated in 1911 within the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Remember, the uprising of the 20,000 had been female shirtwaist makers, the very shirtwaist workers, in fact, that died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire occurred March 25, 1911. 600 workers entered the workplace and 143 never exited with their lives. It was a horrific scene and a very public one. For the first time, the New York public was forced to truly stare at the dangerous conditions of working women and listen to their pleas, not as dangerous social disruptors, but as mothers, sisters, and daughters in their community. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is often studied in history as an event that led to cascading fire and labor reforms in America. While this is true, it did much more than that. As newspapers filled with graphic images of twisted bodies of women who jumped from the factory windows and of snapshots of firemen lugging bodies of young women, charred and dismembered bodies from the building, the public could not seem to tear its eyes away, and for the first time there was an opportunity for powerful public outreach for working women. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire became a tragedy that working women could show to legitimize their complaints. The conditions that working women had struck for only 2 years before in the uprising of the 20,000 now had been proven deadly. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire became a focusing event for working women and the suffrage cause. A focusing event, as you can see on the screen, is a sudden attention-grabbing event that assists in the advancing issues on the agenda as potential triggers for policy change. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was sudden, attention-grabbing, harmful, and revealed the possibility of potentially greater future harms. It also was a local event that gained national attention and led to widespread policy change. So what does this mean? It means that the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was especially powerful in destroying long-standing ideological barriers. It helped working women surpass the negative associations that they had held as unionized workers and helped suffragists point to a distinct negative effect of a lack of female votes. The fire grew to represent the hardship of turn-of-the-century immigrant life, the brutality of working conditions, and the law's absolute indifference to that brutality. The Progressive Era ushered in a time for unique social change and social movement synthesis, creating the ideal environment for the kind of cooperation that grew more evident following the tragedy of the Triangle Fire. There was a nationwide shift within both movements as they simultaneously realized the value in banding together. However, the exhibition of the coalition between working women and suffragists in New York was particularly prominent following the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which became a valuable example of how a social movement synthesis between labor reform and suffragists could be mutually beneficial. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire was a focusing event that helped overcome many of the difficulties facing a union between working women and suffragists. The weeks that followed the tragedy of the fire both fueled and revealed the growing social movement synthesis between working women and suffragists. At the Cooper Union meeting, the public response was overpowering. Cooper Union was a common place for mass meetings in New York at the time, so it was only natural that the meeting would take place there following the fire. There was a mass rally where women and men of all walks of life joined to protest. The big hall was filled and scattered with women draped in heavy black of fresh mourning. One famous face present there was Anna Howard Shaw herself, who spoke for the suffragists at the meeting. While we don't have a full transcript of what Anna Howard Shaw said at the Cooper Union meeting, we can come to a basic consensus of what she would have said because she repeated so many of her themes in most of her speeches. One of which was that women had the right to protect themselves from the government, that all women needed to band together and realize that women were women and they were all in their own way working women, whether it was working in the factories or working at home. She highlighted that the ballot was supreme power in a democracy, and she spoke with tremendous anger, so much so that the New York Times representative there highlighted it. The men were responsible, she said. The government was responsible for this tragedy. Her famous quote from the Cooper Union meeting was that the men of America had tied women's hands and left them to be food for the flames. Women there were present from all walks of life, from all movements, and they were meeting and pushing together in a unified stance and on equal footing for reform and for the vote for women. Though the dominant historical narrative regarding the progressive era largely omits true study of the suffrage movement and speaks of activists as individuals or as parts of singular focus, this does not do justice to the women of the time. Women were pushing for social change in many areas of life and joined together, crossing social boundaries of class and geography for the benefit of all women in the nation. While it did not always come easily, focusing events like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire exhibited the social movement synthesis of the time and offered unique ammunition and a level platform from which working women and suffragists could stand together for labor reform and female enfranchisement in America. Anna Howard Shaw, as an individual, is a reflection of the variety of movements and changes that occurred during her lifetime. She lived a unique life that served as an important bridge between social classes and between different issues that women were facing. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire took vilified working women and gave them back the rightful humanity that the media of the time had stolen, offering them social empathy that they needed and deserved. In addition to the valuable insight my research offered as a new view on Anna Howard Shaw, the working women of New York, and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire as more than just individually interesting events, it also underscored a deeply important truth about history. Anna Howard Shaw, the Cooper Union meeting of 1911, and the working women and suffragists of New York all exhibited this social movement synthesis between working women and suffragists of America. This underscored the common humanity that women shared and the larger wishes for social change shared among women of all walks of life. This research paper serves as a reminder that historical individuals and events are all a part of a larger tapestry of history, within which the threads of humanity are people who care for each other and who wish for the betterment of their nation and the lives of others. Here is a collection of works cited for the images that you saw during this PowerPoint. Thank you. Ta-da!
Hey, that last chunk was big.
Yes, it was. Let's see how long it was. It's not letting me open. There it is.